Go.
Alright, so good morning, class. Did everybody have a good weekend? That's really good to hear. I did as well. So, like we talked about last week and previously throughout this year, we're going to be rolling into the separation of powers and our checks and balances. So, with that being said, it's just going to be a more in-depth talk and discussion than what we've talked about before. So, we already have our primary groups that we've already been breaking into throughout this year. So this lesson is going to be the same as every other. We're going to be utilizing those groups so we can brainstorm for the questions that are asked at the end of this PowerPoint that we'll be talking to, and also brainstorming all of our ideas about the separation of powers and our three branches of government. So does anybody have any questions before we go ahead and start this lesson? Alright, so if nobody has any questions, we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. So, our standards and objectives for this lesson, just like anything else, you're going to apply your social science skills to understand the organization of powers by our national government. And by doing this, you will be examining the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, analyzing the relationship amongst the three branches in a system of checks and balances and our separation of powers. And then finally, our last thing that we will be doing for our standards is investigating and explaining the ways individuals and groups exert influence on the national government. Alright, so kind of the layout of our lesson today. I've already handed you your guided note sheets. You'll be utilizing these to take notes throughout the lesson, and then also answering some of the questions that are on there as well. So, we're going to do the PowerPoint first, and then watch our separation of powers video. Once we watch that video, we'll break up into our three groups. Pull out your whiteboards, dry erase markers, and brainstorm everything you know about the government and separation of powers and checks and balances, and answer our analysis questions at the end of this with your group. So, we're going to demonstrate our responses as a group with our whiteboards. So each group's going to demonstrate what they know, and then everybody's going to gain some knowledge from it, and then we'll be able to have more questions to ask. So, then we'll roll into watching our National Constitution Center video. Once we complete that, you're going to get the worksheet, Who's Got the Power? With this, you're going to do it individually, and you're going to complete that, and then we'll have an active discussion following that. Then, we will finally review the definition of the separation of powers one more time, and the last 30 minutes of the class, we'll be conducting a test to gain your, see what kind of knowledge that you've learned from this lesson. Do you have any questions before we start? Alright, so if we have no more questions, it's going to go ahead and hit the separation of powers. So, dividing different powers amongst the three branches of government. So each branch of government will have a different set of powers. We'll learn more about it later, but it's going to prevent one branch from gaining too much power. So each branch having their own set of powers is going to make it so one branch can't take more power away from another. Finally, our legislative, judicial, and our executive branches have their own unique powers, which we're going to learn here later in this lesson. Alright, so this figure kind of breaks down which each branch has, right? It talks about executive. Enforces laws. Commander-in-Chief's Armed Forces makes foreign treaty proposes laws. And appoints Supreme Court justice and federal court judges. Then they will pardon those that are convicted in a federal court. Your legislative will pass federal laws. They will also control federal appropriations, approve treaties and presidential appointees, and regulate interstate commerce and establish lower court systems. Then we have our final branch of judicial. It will review lower court decisions, decide constitutionality of a law, and then it will decide cases involving disputes between states. Alright, so why do we think it's important for the separation of powers in the government? Anybody want to elaborate on why they think this before we go ahead and talk about it? That's a very good answer. So, with that being said, separation of powers is going to break down even more for these branches. Alright, checks and balances. Alright, powers each branch has that allows them to check up on the other branches. Prevents branches from abusing their powers. We don't want that. We don't want one branch to have more power than the other and be able to abuse that. Then, it's going to preserve the separation of powers and requires cooperation between the branches of government. legislative. It's the House and the Senate, and it can override a presidential veto, impeach and remove the president. It can ratify presidential appointments, authorize appropriations and funds for legislation, check on the judiciary, impeach and remove judges, and confirms federal judges. Next, we have our executive branch. And our executive branch is our president and our cabinet. They will propose legislation, which is a law. They will veto legislation, make treaties with foreign countries, check on the judiciary, appoint federal judges, and finally enforce court decisions. Alright, so for our judicial branch, it is the Supreme Court and lower courts, and they will review executive decisions, check on Congress, review congressional laws, judicial review, executive and the legislative, and then finally Supreme Court justices are appointed for life or until they retire. Alright, so this is kind of a breakdown of exactly what we just talked about, so go ahead and take a look at this, take notes as needed, and then we will go ahead and continue on with our lesson. Alright, since we've gone over this and everybody's taken a look and taken all the notes they would like, this is a breakdown of the checks and balances. So, confirms or rejects appointments by executive, including judges, is all three branches. Then, you'll have your executive, which can veto legislation. And they can also appoint judges and judicial. Then, legislative will write your laws. Executive will enforce them, and judicial will interpret them. So, you can declare acts of legislative or executive branch to be unconstitutional. Judicial does this with both your legislative and your executive. Do we have any questions before we continue? Okay. This is our final analysis. I was talking about this at the beginning. It's going to give you a couple questions that you're going to take into your groups with you as you brainstorm, answer these questions, and then we'll go ahead and talk about them with each individual group on our whiteboards and be able to gain more knowledge from the other groups. So, these questions are, what are some of the problems with the checks and balance system? So what do we think some of the problems are with our system? Go ahead and take some time in your groups and answer this question. Alright, and then we have the Constitution is vague in some parts of these powers. How can this cause a problem for each branch? What do we think is vague, and how can we fix these problems? And how can it cause a problem for each of our branches? Then we have, how does this system promote cooperation between the branches of government? So that's going to take some time for you all to be able to do. So go ahead and write all these questions down, and then we will go ahead and jump into our groups to answer them. Alright, thank you. And final question, which branch has the most power and why? And it's up to you to decide which one it is and explain to us why at the end. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and break into our groups. We're first going to open up this video on our computers and be able to watch this. Once we complete this, then you'll be able to break down and brainstorm more about our lesson. So go ahead and take some time and watch this. Alright, thank you so much. So, now that we're going to break into our groups, take some time to answer all these questions, brainstorm, and then we'll go ahead and talk about what we've learned. Alright, thank you all for taking the time. About 10 minutes was a good amount of time for everybody to do that. So we're going to give each group 5 minutes to talk about what they've learned, brainstorm, and answer those questions that they have. Alright, thank you group 1, thank you group 2, thank you group 3. Alright, so next we're going to watch this video from the Constitutional Hall Pass, Separation of Powers, National Constitution Center. Go ahead and take notes as you please on your worksheets that were handed out in the beginning, and make sure that you understand what you need to know and any questions you want to ask at the end of this lesson. Okay, thank you for watching the video. Next, we got our worksheet. Who's got the power? So we're going to go ahead and fill these out as a group or individually, and fill out all of these saying which branch does what. Okay, thank you. So now we're going to go over it. So with that being said, everything that we've discussed today, what did we say that checks and balances was? Great job, you're absolutely right. So with separation of powers as well, your separation of powers is going to be able to break down into 3 branches and make sure one branch doesn't abuse another branch. So each individual branch has its own set of powers because they only perform those specific duties. Does anybody have any comments, anything that relates to this that they have input on before we go ahead and take this test? Nobody has any questions? All right, so last 30 minutes of this class, we're going to take a test on everything we've learned. So take everything off your desks. Go ahead and just leave a piece of paper and a pencil, and I'm going to hand out those tests. All right, everybody has their test. You got 30 minutes. Any questions, please raise your hand. Don't interrupt other people, and make sure that you are actually taking the time to read the question and answer the question to the best of your knowledge. All right, thanks, class. So thank you for turning in all your tests, and I really appreciate all your input that you've done today. You all did a great job on these tests, and I really just want you to be able to keep this knowledge for once we get to the end of the class, for you to put everything together that we've learned. All right, so y'all are dismissed.